So today's panel, we have Erin Houlihan, class of 2011. 2011, wow. Susan Sajadi from the class of 2005. Chris Dunn from the class of 2004. And Jonathan Kaufman from the class of Harvard and Princeton Public Policy. I don't even know what year you graduated.
Law School 06 and Princeton 08.
So actually that's neat, because you're all kind of the same generation, more or less. Erin Houlihan is here representing the work that she does in the field in post-conflict situations. She works with the Institute for International
Law and Human Rights. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. And also has worked with the UN Development Program, UNDP, as a consultant. And Susan Sajadi works with Susan Burke, so you don't have to be Susan. She does human rights litigation and has some really interesting cases that she's been working on. And has also worked in, well, I'm not going to tell you where else they work, but because they work. Chris Dunn has been working with the Millennium Challenge Corporation. And Jonathan Kaufman is working now with Earthrights International, which some of you may know was founded by a couple of UVA graduates, Katie Redford, Tyler Giannini, and Rick Kurtz. I have a couple of things that I wanted to just announce, because I know sometimes people slip away early, but I wanted to take a minute to tell you that there are 2 fellowships that you should know about for human rights summer work, and also possibly for postgraduate. One of them is to go to South Africa. We have the class of 1957. This is sort of a one-off deal. We've had it in the past, but this is pretty much the swan song. But it's $2,500 grant to work in human rights in South Africa this summer. And we will be we'll be sending out information about how to apply. The application won't be due before probably January 1st or January 15th. It'll be a ways away. But I want you to know about it because you can be thinking about where you might want to work. And you can also speak with me or the folks from the Public Service Center, who you should turn around and wave. By the way, we are happy to have the Public Service Center co-sponsoring with us. And I think a lot of the first years are in the process of this discussion with them. And the other fellowship which you should know about is the Monroe Lee Fellowship for Public International Law, which is a $10,000 grant, which we usually split between 2 students. 3Ls are welcome to apply for that, and you'll be hearing more about that too. The deadlines are going to be pretty much similar. You'll be applying for these things in January or so. But I wanted to put those out. I wanted you to know about the South Africa Fellowship because it's pretty exciting, and neither of these are exclusive of PLLC. Okay? All right, so let's get started. So I wanted to do, other than just kind of going 1, 2, 3, 4 and having the 4 of them tell their story for 5 or 7 minutes, I thought I would use a question process, which is pretty much going to get the same information, but it will be a little bit more of a conversation, I think, this way. And that way we also will try to give you folks maximum time to ask your questions, because I'm sure you'll have some. So the first question will be, what was your path to the job? People like to know whether, what kinds of things they might be thinking about as they go forward. Was this something that you had known you wanted to do, this area of work that you're in right now? So forth. So why don't we start with Chris, since you are, I think, the oldest graduate.
Great. Yeah, yeah.
School earlier.
Yes, so, as Tina said, I work now at the Millennium Challenge Corporation. And actually may be a little different than other people on the panel. I'm not really focused as an attorney at MCC, which is the acronym, on human rights per se. Rather, the organization's focus and my focus is on poverty alleviation and sort of through economic growth in obviously developing countries. And so, I think that gets back to sort of my career path, though, because I think there's sort of an obvious confluence between those things, but one that I think I struggled with for a long time figuring out where being a lawyer had the best fit for me in terms of focusing on poverty reduction issues and economic development. All sorts of debates about which comes first, how it works, but I think to a certain extent, no matter what you're looking at, a society that is pluralistic, has respect for individual civil and political rights, creates the preconditions for economic growth and development to take place. And that's certainly the models that MCC tries to adopt in identifying countries to partner with on these large-scale international economic development programs that we implement. And so, for me, I very much as an undergrad focused on advocacy work, civil rights work, and political work in particular in the Middle East. And frankly finished undergrad thinking, well, I don't really want to do that. It didn't feel tangible to me. It felt like I wasn't really having the impact I wanted to have. And so I sort of fluttered around trying to figure out what I would do. And by chance ended up at an impact litigation organization that's based in Israel doing work on behalf of Palestinian citizens of Israel. And Abdullah, I don't know, the Human Rights Clinic may still work with them, but I ended up working there for about a year, and I think for me it was a bit of a watershed moment where I realized, yes, poverty reduction can often take the forms of large infrastructure works, building roads, basic water connections, all the things that people need to create the conditions to generate livelihood and income. And I'm just not really good at any of those things. But what I am good at is, research, writing, arguing, whatever it is. And I think that working at Adela as just before law school, one of the first cases we worked on was literally connecting unrecognized villages to basic municipal services inside the state of Israel. And it was a real profound moment here where I figured, wow, this is a skill set that I feel like I sort of have. I'm not an engineer, but I can do this through legal work, and ultimately went to law school because of that experience. And then at law school, I think as well, I found it difficult to, at law school, to find a pathway that ultimately led to where I am now. I was actually fortunate enough to be a recipient of the Monroe Lee Fellowship when I graduated, and ended up actually going to Sierra Leone, where I worked for the Special Court for Sierra Leone in the prosecutor's office. And actually worked with the Human Rights Study Group, Human Rights Study Project in my 3L year as well, and also focused on going to Sierra Leone. And even in that context, while we were focused on international criminal law, for me a big part of the experience was the court's focus on rule of law development issues in Sierra Leone, the focus on being embedded within the country where the atrocities that are being tried actually occurred, and the sort of the example of justice being served as a way of instilling the rule of law generally. And so that, in a roundabout way, led me ultimately to come back to figuring out how I wanted to work on poverty reduction issues through the lens of my legal experience. And I can stop there. I'm sure we'll keep talking about it.
Yeah, and that's a good place to stop you, because the next question will be, what do you do today? So why don't we hear from you? Okay.
I knew I wanted to do human rights development, but I didn't also really know what that means, or what the branches of it are and how it all interconnects. I started. I did Teach for America before law school, and through that saw a lot of the poverty issues and how education impacts people's lives, and how different life experiences between men and women, and so that kind of race and gender awareness issues and other things. And took that experience. It was supposed to come immediately to law school, but wanted a little bit more life focus and to get outside the United States. So I took that and went to Istanbul for 2 years and taught English as a second language. I mean, it was just a reason to be there, which was great, and had some sort of additional, I was there when there was transitions of power to the current more conservative government, and saw what was going on with refugees coming in from Iraq and other places, and sort of took that to law school, knowing I wanted to do something in the Middle East. I was also interested in Africa, having traveled through there, so it was a sort of unfocused goal of doing human rights work. And here, obviously with the Human Rights Clinic and talking to Dina and finding out what different organizations do. I mean, that was sort of the first step for me, was who's out there doing what that I might be interested in. And there were some good connections here. That's where I was connected to my current NGO. That's where I sort of looked at what is the difference between an NGO and an international organization like the UN, for example, or different mandates of different groups, if you want to be with the ICRC or anything like that, and sort of started to understand, or Human Rights Watch, there's difference between advocacy and monitoring versus program implementation on the ground. And that was just something that, there's no set place that you can go to figure that out. It's just asking questions and meeting people from different organizations. So that was really helpful. And my 1L summer, I interned with my current NGO and we do a lot of rule of law and human rights programming through different grants. And that means that we actually we work in Baghdad mostly with the Iraqi parliament and with a lot of civil society groups, and support legislative drafting on human rights issues. So that's domestic violence, that's social security reform, it's freedom of information, institutional development as well, balance of power, and trying to get rule of law to be something that people adhere to. And so that was a lot of research and comparative writing. So that allowed me to explore what different legal systems do. There's different ways to protect human rights. There's different ways to sort of institutionalize democratic values, and giving comparative examples for the Iraqis to work on. And at that time, that was just DC based. Then I just continued my relationship with them through pro bono work, and had a very unique law school experience. I ended up making about 10 trips to Baghdad as a fellow with that NGO while in law school, and everybody was really nice about letting me miss classes to do that, a lot of classes. So that sort of just got the foot in the door, and in doing that, I designed the first application for human rights commissioners to apply for that position within the new Iraqi Human Rights Commission back in 2009. And you don't really see where that goes. You just sort of send it off into the ether. And when I was able to go to Iraq and meet the people, they said, oh, you're the one who did this, and yes, it worked, and here's what we used, and here's how things changed. And you start to see how research that you have done fits into draft laws and policies that people are promoting. So in traveling to Iraq, I ended up being hired by this NGO, which is very, very small. And I now serve as the legal advisor, which basically means that I do research on what laws should look like on how to structure things. So don't get into that. Yeah. And the UN consultancy came through that work, basically, because you're in a small community where there's a need, a little piece that people need you to fit into. So it's much easier once you're there to also just find other work.
No. Why don't we go to Jonathan as another NGO person?
So I'll try and be as quick as possible.
You have 4 minutes.
So I actually, bizarrely, find myself more or less where I set out to go when I decided to go to law school. I lived in Taiwan for a while on a Fulbright grant after college, and I was working with indigenous groups there. And the thing that always fascinated me and kind of alarmed me was the fact that these people who suffer the same problems as indigenous and minority groups suffer all over the world, low levels of education, domestic violence, high levels of alcoholism, unemployment. They were constantly losing ground in terms of their traditions and their land and their access to natural resources, to private companies and to government action. And in my fairly sort of legally ignorant mind, I said to myself, well, if these guys were in the US, we would just, pardon the expression, sue the bastards. But that system doesn't exist in this country. And so I started to say to myself, maybe I can go to law school and do that kind of thing. I can represent indigenous groups who are trying to preserve their land rights, their access to natural resources, and generally to defend their human rights. But I also recognized that because there was not the same system of litigation and law as a tool for social justice as we have in the US, I wanted to learn more about economics and politics and in sociology. And so I applied to law school and also to public policy programs. And while at law school, I basically poured as much time as I could into clinical work, above all, Human Rights Clinic, where I happened to meet Tyler Giannini, a UVA grad who founded the organization that I work for now. And in terms of things that I spent a lot of time on, I mean, really, in my mind, what I was doing with the clinic clicked with me so much more than a lot of the academic classes that I was taking. And so, not to the degree that Erin just mentioned, but I really, sacrificed a lot of class time for clinic time and for project time, because this was what was like a burning, sort of a burning interest and imperative for me. So, for example, when the opportunity came up to work on a case in front of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and the Human Rights Clinic warned that if you took this on, then you would essentially pour the next 3 weeks of your time into that and would not have time for anything else. But at the end of it, you would actually go to the court and you would be part of the argument. I said, absolutely, sign me up. And then once that had happened, and it was true, I don't know what happened to my classes. Once that happened, then when another opportunity came up, you were already one of the go-to people, and so then you did it. And so that was really amazing, but I finished law school feeling that I really wanted nothing to do with litigation. And I was tired of sort of batting around these abstract ideas of international law and justice that had no answers. And I really thought that I wanted to be more in the sort of direct realm of policy. So then I went to policy school where everybody was going into government, and loved the analytical side of things, really learned a lot about economics and econometric statistical analysis that I think have really informed the way that I think about social issues. But by the time I was done, I said, this is crazy, no, I want to be a litigator after all. And then at that point, things just kind of fell into place. I think it was a combination of luck and me having made a bunch of choices that turned out in retrospect to have been smart choices, and having met a lot of the right people from the work that I had done through summers, through clinics. And Earthrights had just had money that year to offer a fellowship for brand new lawyers. And one of the things that you guys will learn if you're going to the human rights field directly, or trying to, is that almost the only way, one of the very few ways to get jobs as a newly minted lawyer in the field is as a one-year fellow, which allows you to get your feet wet and learn and basically meet people and hope that that parlays into something further on. It's a really unsure sort of a situation, but that is one of the few opportunities that sort of lifts up people and brings new blood into the field. So Earthrights offered a fellowship, and it was amazing, and it was great, and then there was no money to hire anybody on at the end of that fellowship. And in fact, the foundation that offered the fellowship had lost all its money in the Bernie Madoff scandal, so there was no more forthcoming fellowship money. But right at the end of that year, we settled a big case, and suddenly Earthrights had some extra money, and they created a position, and I'm it. So that's how I got to where I am.
That's great. Thanks. Susan?
Okay, well, I don't think as much of a conventional route to the human rights work. I went to Georgetown as an undergrad. I was in the School of Foreign Service, and I was a very good liberal arts student. I was the, jack of all trades, master of none. If it was anything that I was interested in, I took that class. I thought it was interesting, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life. But, my parents said you have to keep going to school. So I decided to go to law school because I didn't want to go to business school or medical school. And it was really, and I admit this, I think a lot of people come to law school with that because you think, well, I can't do these other things. And it's just as important, I think, I will say this, to know what you want to do as it is to know what you don't want to do, and to cross things off your list and say, I don't want to do this, I know I don't want to do that. So graduated from Georgetown. I went over to Japan. I spent a year with the JET program teaching English in a rural rice farming community as the only foreigner, which was fascinating. And then I came back and I got into UVA, decided to go. And then I thought, maybe I'll just put this off for one more year and do something else. And September 11th happened right then. That was in 2001. And I thought, well, I was interested in sort of some of the ways certain things were being portrayed in the media in the Middle East and whether or not these things actually happened as people were saying they happened. And so I went over to Istanbul and got a job at the Wall Street Journal, and which was a fascinating experience. This was right at the time when when Daniel Pearl was being held hostage and no one knew what happened to him, and this guy, Hugh Pope, said, okay, well, I'll give you a job. I'm overwhelmed and there's a lot going on. And so I took the job. I spent a year there working for him and working for a publishing company as well called the Oxford Business Group. And then I thought, okay, now I'm ready for law school. So I came back, took a bunch of different classes, nothing that was particularly human rights focused, although it was always an interest of mine as it had been as an undergraduate. And the practicalities of, being in law school and paying for it yourself and coming out with $150,000 in debt sunk in at some point. And I thought, okay, what do I do now? So after my first year, I went to Kay Scholler in DC. I was a summer associate there. And then my second year, I split my summer between King and Spalding in Atlanta and Sidley Austin in New York. And I thought, okay, this corporate stuff isn't so bad. They treat you nicely. Let's see if we can do this. So I graduated from law school. I chose Sidley. I went to Sidley in New York. I started in the capital markets group doing corporate transactions. I did Australian underwriting instruments. If you want to know what that is, I don't really know what those are, but that's what I was doing. I spent 2 years doing capital markets work, and I went to Australia a lot, and that was all interesting, and this was all international law. And I quickly came to realize that international law at a big law firm really means that you are awake 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Because I was in New York, my clients were in Australia, my partner was in London. So a 3 a.m., 4 a.m. phone call was not out of the ordinary, unfortunately. And so, I did that for 2 years, and I was thinking to myself, I don't really want to do this kind of work. So I'm crossing this off the list again. Corporate work, not for me. During that time, though, and I think Sidley was actually a really great place to work. They had a really great pro bono program. And so I spent a lot of time doing asylum work. I did asylum work for an Afghan refugee, a Haitian refugee. And I started thinking, well, the corporate side of things in terms of capital transaction, that's not for me. But maybe if I switch to litigation, there could be sort of an avenue into doing something that I want to do on a daily basis. So I talked to the firm and I convinced them to send me over to the litigation group, and I did that, and I really actually enjoyed litigation. So that was something that a realization that people come to much earlier in their law school career, their legal career, but that didn't come to me until I was really a third-year associate. So I said, okay, I really like litigation, and again, I was doing a lot of pro bono work that I really, really enjoyed. And then I got engaged, and my husband was moving to Charlottesville, and he said, we're getting married, come along. I didn't really want to leave New York, I admit. I love Charlottesville, I love going to school here, but I wasn't entirely sure that I wanted to come back here full time, but whatever. So I came back, and I didn't know what to do. And here I am again at this sort of a little bit of a crossroads where I realized I've crossed a lot of stuff off of my list of things I don't want to do. And I'm looking around at my friends, all of whom were corporate attorneys at that point, like in a corporate law firm. And they weren't, people, they say lawyers aren't really happy, and it's true, because you sort of can get sucked into a little bit of a vortex, and then you realize, 6 years, 8 years, 10 years later, oh my God, what the hell am I doing here? And you're making good money, and so you like to buy nice things, you have nice dinners, and you sort of get sucked into that. I can talk about that for hours, but that does happen. And then it happened to me. That was happening to me. So I came to Charlottesville and I thought, okay, well, I want to do something that's a little bit more interesting than what I was doing on a day-to-day basis. So I actually contacted Dina, and Dina recommended this little law firm that was based in DC. They had an office in Charlottesville, and they were doing human rights work. And I thought, this is exactly, I've crossed all this stuff off of my list, but the thing that I keep going back to, is the pro bono work that I do, the asylum work that I did. I did a lot of work in college with female genital circumcision in Africa. So there was that interest, but I just didn't know how to package that into something. So I spent a little bit of time working in the admissions office here, and while I was trying to figure out what to do next, and I got hired by this little law firm in DC. And coincidentally, we do now all of this work with torture and the Abu Ghraib torture scandal. We are suing the defense contractors and military rape litigation, and so it's really opened up a big array of things for me, which we'll go into in a second. But so I will say that the path wasn't exactly, as a little girl, I didn't say, oh, I really want to do human rights law, or I did, and no one really says, oh, I really want to be a corporate attorney. But the practicalities of that, I think, come into play a little bit, and that's just something to consider. I really liked working at Sidley. I think it gave me an incredible experience, incredible training, incredible resources. But I did have to step back and think about it for a second and say, is this really what I want to do every day for the rest of my life?
Thanks. Lot of things here. Let's go into the second question, which is what's your day-to-day work like? I guess the kinds of things that we want you to address here are maybe things that you like and dislike, but also some things that you want to dispel misconceptions about what you do. Right? So, two of you do more or less litigation, though Jonathan does more than litigation, and two of you have sort of more of a field-based rule of law kind of thing. Jonathan, do you want to start with your?
Sure. So a very basic overview of what I do at Earthrights. Earthrights works with people around the world to try and redress corporate human rights abuses that have an environmental aspect. So for the most part, we're talking about big US or foreign companies that go into other countries and badly pollute the natural environment in indigenous communities or end up getting mixed up with local brutal military forces who then do terrible things to people when they dare to resist or protest the highly polluting or otherwise abusive operations of the company. So litigation is kind of one of our banner things that we do, but in addition we do a lot of policy work, and that involves trying to develop international mechanisms for accountability. It involves pushing the US government to take a more progressive stance and enact policies that will create some form of accountability or transparency for what companies are doing in these countries. And although I would say most of the time my primary job is litigation, sometimes up to like 40% of my time is really spent on this policy work and kind of working with the government or working with international organizations, working in coalitions, and trying to change the structure and the framework. I guess I don't know about misconceptions, but I would say that the thing that, well, maybe the one misconception that I would say is that human rights litigation is not all about, like going and reading, the sort of ancient international authors and like reading the travaux préparatoires of the International Criminal Court statute. It's mostly about civil procedure. So really the one textbook that I actually have from law school that I have on that I have on my shelf that I actually sometimes open are my civil procedure textbook and my conflict of laws textbook. So really the nuts and bolts of litigation are the same whether you're doing corporate litigation or human rights litigation, and you really, really have to know that stuff. But in terms of what I like and what I don't like, I love the fact that there's a ton of variety in what I do. Sometimes I'll sort of count up the different things that I worked on during the day, and it'll be a dozen or more completely different projects that exercise different parts of my brain. And it ranges from actual hardcore, just like legal research and writing, to working with other lawyers, working with coalition partners in Nigeria or India or Peru, to going to a meeting on the Hill where we're trying to convince a congressman to, be interested in a bill or put in some sort of a letter to a federal agency whose processes we're trying to influence. So that is really fantastic. I think that the thing that I like less, I guess, about the work that we do, and particularly about the litigation, is that it's usually about picking up the pieces after something terrible has already happened. And so I guess that's why the policy work is sometimes more satisfying, or it feels like you're getting at the root of the problem. Of course, it's even slower going than litigation, and it's harder to measure the outcomes. But I wish that we had a better legal tool for dealing with problems before they start.
Speaking of picking up the pieces, Susan, do you want to?
Sure. Well, the work that I do now, which I alluded to earlier, all of the work as it relates to the human rights component of what we do, is basically everything that's sort of arisen out of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So we represent, for instance, individuals that were in Abu Ghraib who were tortured against the defense contractors who did the torturing. We represent men and women who have been raped or sexually assaulted in the military. which they made a great movie about, which I recommend seeing if you haven't seen it. It's called The Invisible War, which highlights that story and the stories of a lot of our clients. We represent U.S. service members that have been harmed by negligent defense contracting practices like, burn pits and a lot of sort of environmental hazards that have arisen in Iraq and Afghanistan. And most recently we filed a child molestation case against a church that was involved in child sex abuse. So it's very sort of rape, torture, child molestation. It's not the most uplifting work on a daily basis. So I think a little bit of what that takes is sort of divorcing yourself from what happens. And yes, it's all very interesting. And there isn't a day, actually, I can say there hasn't been a day yet that I've been practicing law in this firm that I've woken up and said, I just don't want to do this today. Every day I can go to bed saying, well, I think I did something that helped somebody today. But in terms of sort of dispelling that, you are picking up the pieces for individuals, for real people that are calling you every single day with something that happened to them. And you have to be able to be empathetic and compassionate while at the same time thinking, okay, how can we sort of make this into how can we get a legal solution for them or a legal remedy for them? So I think sometimes, when I was in school, we would read this stuff and think, oh, this is interesting, or this is how the law developed and whatever. But at the end of the day, it's real people that are really impacted, and they are calling you all the time. And you sort of need to be able to have that aspect of being able to deal with people and handhold them through really, for them, they might be one of 100 clients for you, but for that person, this is their life, and this is what happened to them.
Maybe I could just ask quickly, the two of you, how often are you in court? And are you actually doing arguments, or your colleagues doing arguments? Is it mostly strategizing the cases, those kinds of pieces of the
We're in court all the time. I do litigation, and I do the arguments, and we had, and I've second chaired trial, and I've done everything sort of from initial client meetings all the way through to trial in front of the judge, which is scary. But, it gets less scary every time you do it. And that's an opportunity, I will say, that a lot of lawyers, A, don't have, because most lawyers are not in the courtroom all the time, and B, as an associate in a big law firm, you would never have. I feel bad actually saying never, but really never have it. It's sort of on the junior level, you would never have it. Yes, this is as a mid-level or senior associate. Perhaps you would get yourself into court, but really the court is the fun stuff, and that's what the partners want to do. So they don't really want to let junior people do that.
I have a sort of opposite experience. The cases that we work on are long and complicated. They can take a decade or more, and generally there's not, until you get to trial, which may never happen, or if it happens, it may only happen after 10 years. There's the hearings on the motions to dismiss and that sort of thing are very, very spaced out. We also work in coalition with other lawyers, small law firms, other organizations, and in my experience, it actually generally has been the more senior members of those coalition teams that will end up in court, mostly because it's so strung out and the stakes have gotten so high when you actually are in front of the judge that it makes sense for the really experienced lawyers to do it. That said, there's a case that I've really built, and that is more or less my baby, I guess I would say, for the first time. And if and when there is oral argument, I imagine that I'll be involved in it more. But our cases tend to be much more fought out on the papers, and the hearings are very, very few and far between. But then once you're at trial, it's all hands on deck.
Thanks. Chris, why don't you tell us about your work day-to-day and misconceptions people might have?
Just by way of background, because I probably didn't explain this all that well, the Millennium Challenge Corporation is a government agency, a specialized government agency focusing on foreign assistance, similar to USAID, but with a slightly different mandate. So we focus, again, primarily on economic development, poverty reduction, and I guess one of the, and this all gets to my day-to-day job, but one of the sort of hallmarks of the MCC approach is to identify partner countries that we can work with that in fact actually have demonstrated a commitment to rule of law, investments in their people, education, immunization rates, and economic freedom. And that the way the annual selection process works for the countries we work with, and we work with something like 23 around the world now, is to go to NGOs and different institutions that collect sort of third-party objective data on the degree to which a country is more or less corrupt, or the degree to which a country is controlling its inflation rates, all of which, we think creates the preconditions to which economic development can really happen and take place. And so, echoing sort of Susan's point about knowing what you don't want to do, I found I really didn't like litigation at all, frankly, and I felt that law school really geared me towards litigation work. That's what it prepared me to do. And I found that that's not particularly what I was interested in. And one thing I didn't mention when I was talking about my background is I actually spent 3 years at a corporate law firm as well in New York, focused on a practice called project finance, which is essentially financing large infrastructure. How does that happen? It's a little different than other types of finance. And again, I actually really did enjoy that. I was working primarily in the Gulf and different emerging markets in the power sector, and it was both on the sort of regulatory side as to how do you really structure a power sector to make it sustainable, and how do you deliver power to all levels of society, and then how do you finance that? Persian Gulf. Persian Gulf, the Emirates specifically. So I spent a lot of time on the road, 4 a.m. phone calls wherever it was with the finance group in London and my group back in New York, and then me alone in Abu Dhabi sitting around at 3 a.m. But I liked it, to be honest. I really did enjoy it, and I found that what I think people would sort of call the transactional side work of being a lawyer was really enjoyable. And so what drew me to MCC, was this sort of solid foundational focus on how we go about choosing and working with different countries. Primarily geared towards unlocking the biggest constraints to economic growth in those countries. Sometimes infrastructure, sometimes rule of law, sometimes taxation issues, sometimes just basic corruption. How do we develop and design and implement programs that tackle those issues? And so as a lawyer on a day-to-day basis at MCC, I'm applying some of the skills that I gathered as a corporate associate in New York in terms of drafting contracts, helping sort out the contractual arrangements between all the different parties that might need to be involved in building a road, or to help my counterparts I work in Senegal, Benin, Zambia, and Armenia, helping my counterparts in those governments think about how to have the most leverage over the people they're working with to make sure that they're actually getting what they pay for, and that these roads are ultimately will achieve the outputs that we all want, both the U.S. government and our partner governments and the communities that those partner governments serve. But then in terms of the sort of day-to-day international law work, fundamentally because MCC is a U.S. government agency, we, as a lawyer and operations lawyer, I'm negotiating what are in effect bilateral treaties that the U.S. government signs with our partner governments that outline and describe the program that we mutually agree to carry out and implement. That entails quite a bit of just sort of foreign affairs law research in terms of the jurisdictions we're going to be working in to ensure that the programs will be carried out the way we want them to, that there aren't laws in those countries that would contradict or make problematic the implementation of those programs. And then, again, it's helping figure out really how to structure these programs so that they are in the long run sustainable. Again, an example, working in Zambia, we're actually trying to rehabilitate the core water network in the city of Lusaka. The theory of change being that people will then be less susceptible, or there'll be lower prevalence of malaria and waterborne diseases, which in turn creates more productive time for people to invest in education and economic activity. And part of the story, though, is how do we make sure that really poor people who can't pay for connections actually find a way to have water connected to their home. And so as one of the operations attorneys, my day-to-day job as we developed that program was to think about the points at which we can ask the government to put financial contributions in place, when they should be put in place, how we can ensure that the timing is such that we ensure that by the end of our program, the 2 million people in Lusaka that we want to benefit include not just the rich, wealthy landowners who then can turn around and charge exorbitant rents, but also the poorest of the poor in those communities. So I guess I'll leave it at that, but it's definitely more of a transactional type work, which is not something I think a lot of law students are particularly familiar with, because you just don't do it in law school.
Thanks. Erin?
Yeah, and I'm sort of actually far less on the legal side of any of that. We work for an NGO, and as Chris was talking about programming that he'll design, for example, we will be recipients of, say, the U.S. State Department will develop a series of grants targeting, for example, women's parliament or development of women parliamentarians in terms of skill sets, or the European Union or UNOPS, or all these different groups that sort of have, or sovereign governments will have pockets of money and programs to forward specific human rights or rule of law or good governance agendas. And then as an NGO, we will bid on that, and you're a grant recipient. So a large part of what I do is writing grants, which is interesting but really boring work sometimes too. So if you win a grant, basically, then we're very small, so that sort of allows me to do both program management stuff and the legal advising and technical advice. So basically what we'll do, or what I have done, is a lot of women's empowerment and women's rights issues, and I specify women and not gender rights because that's a whole other ballgame in Iraq. But I provide technical advice or technical expertise to, say, the Human Rights Committee in Parliament, and that is a lot of legal or legislative development and legislative reform, and so that's where American law school and a knowledge of the American system is sort of less. It's great foundationally to understand what you need for a good bill, and to be able to look at other people's laws and systems and understand them. But it's a lot more, I will sort of sit and talk about definition sections, talk about expanding, the issue that we're addressing. Where do you pull in women? Where do you pull in indigenous peoples? Where do you look at, how is this legislation going to be drafted to be useful and to be compliant with the Iraqi constitutional and legal system, as well as their international obligations. And a lot of that is conflict of laws issues. So that's where the research side and advising side of that comes in. We also, I worked, the UNDP part of my work was with the new Human Rights Commission, and there's a big international framework for national human rights institutions to monitor the situation of human rights, advise on legislation. They interact with UN and international organizations on compliance with Millennium Development, or with various human rights obligations. And then there's also the civil society side of it, where it's advocacy work, and it's if someone has a particular component, minority component in Iraq, needs to get a message out, they're being persecuted, they're discriminated against, so it's trying to help them better structure their outreach programs to inform the public, to say, okay, what do you need, what changes are you looking for in the government, and then connect them to members of parliament or members or ministries or whatever it is to try to get some advancements in this stuff. So it's a lot of advocacy work and just providing the technical expertise that is otherwise lacking within Iraq itself, because they haven't had a functional civil society, for example. They haven't had a lot of people who were able to have experience as politicians and things like that. So it's kind of a jack of all trades, master of none program. Like, we do minority rights and gender rights, and I'm doing asylum issues right now, and that's a great thing about being in a small NGO. And the good thing about being at an NGO is that you're not tied to the US government's policies. Sometimes what we might advocate from a human rights perspective doesn't necessarily align with what the US wants. And you've got LGBTI issues in Iraq right now, for example, that are very touchy, and a government can't go in and demand that you protect LGBTI persons, for example, but we can. Or Jews in Iraq, for example, which is also a touchy issue for, there's all these things that you can't do as a government that we can do, because we're grants, not contracts.
Actually, if I can just say, one of the things that you talked about, the drawbacks, and I didn't mention, but I do think the politics, being a U.S. government employee, the politics is clearly can be a drawback or a greater disadvantage to what goes on a day-to-day basis. I think my organization tries to insulate itself from politics to a certain extent by sort of relying on third parties to prepare rankings that essentially feed into who we can even work with. So we try to sort of take some politically expedient country partners off the table just by virtue of the way we sort of go through a selection process. But certainly there are frustrations, being part of a political piece that is ultimately, reliant on Congress for appropriations and funding is very different than being at an NGO or in many cases maybe being an adverse party to a government in litigation.
Great, thanks. Well, with the last 10 minutes before we open it up, why don't we go to that third question, which is, what's the most important piece of advice you'd give law students, people who are thinking that they might like to go into a human rights career, whether it's going to be right away or after a few years of paying off debt. Who wants to start?
Sure, I'll start. I think probably the single piece of advice I would have is to be persistent. I think that, the way that, for instance, I got the job that I'm in right now is by basically calling and emailing, and we were only texting back then, but there was just putting yourself in front of somebody and saying, I can do this. I think a lot of what happens, and I'm not saying this to be mean, but we to end up at UVA Law, you do really well in high school and you've done really well in college, and you have this feeling by the end of all of it that you're really special. And you're not. And I mean that in the nicest possible way. Everyone, it's sort of it's a little bit triangular shape, but when you're getting close to the top, everybody is really smart, and everybody's gone to a really good school, and everybody can work hard, and everybody has a good work ethic. And you have to think, what is it that's going to take me apart from every single other person? And a lot of that is really, it's not just, I'm just going to send out like 50 resumes and see what happens. So you send out the resumes, and then you target the person that you want to talk to, and that could be all 50 of them, but you have to go to those people and say, I'm willing to do this, and this is why, and putting yourself in front of somebody, I'm not suggesting you stalk people, but putting yourself in front of somebody and being persistent, I think will set you apart from all the other people that are, as smart and talented as you all, I'm sure, are.
Erin, what about you?
The persistence is a really good one. I guess I would say two things, because it is a lot. It is luck. I'm sorry. Yeah, there are a lot of people who apply for like the South African Fellowship, for example. There are a lot of people who apply to organizations that can't necessarily afford to keep you. So going to things like this, and networking, it sounds really terrible, but just meeting someone that works for an organization that you can then pursue and follow up on and keep tabs on to see if they ever do have openings. Just use that. Send emails, get to know people, because that it's a relatively, at least the development side that I do is a relatively small community. So that's an important thing to start getting to know people. But it's also the sort of broad spectrum of international law and treaties and things that we all talk about and hold up above our heads and say you have to follow this. You also, if you're doing something on the ground or particularly in the field, you need to understand the particular legal framework within which you're working. Someone can say like, yep, CEDAW, we got it, and I choose to apply it sometimes, and other times I don't really feel like it, and that's the reality. So you also have to understand, take employment law classes. Take classes that matter when you're when in the broader human rights situation. If there is a discrimination issue or there is something that you're trying to reform, you have to understand the particular area of law that you're working on. So human rights side of things is great, but don't then shirk the contracts, the employment stuff, or any of that other, because that actually gives you a foundation for anything else that you're going to do.
And since you did just the opposite, Jonathan, you want to go next? Actually, I was going to point out too that you said luck, but you also said smart choices were part of your profile. So
it's easy to say that in retrospect.
Yeah.
I was really.
I would absolutely echo Erin's point about meeting people. It is, all of these fields are small, and everyone ends up knowing each other. And if you just have the opportunity to offer, your services, as a little bit of extra time when you have some extra time. We brought someone back as a summer intern who had spent just like a week with us when they had a little bit of time in January, and then had kind of put themselves on our radar screen. And we know each other, and we get so many resumes and so many kind of requests to participate in the stuff that we do that it's terrible, but you always end up looking first at the people who have already gotten their foot in the door. So how did you get your foot in the door? As Sarah says, you were persistent, you expressed interest, you met, you shook hands, you sent something in, you were useful in some way. So there's just really no substitute for just finding some time to be present and do it. The other thing that I would just say is if you want to work on international human rights issues, you have to get yourself abroad. You can't just be an interior, like inside a library person. Like, I mean, well, you can, I'm sorry. But it is incredibly useful when someone says, well, you know, our organization spends a lot of time in Burma, for example. And suddenly Burma shot onto the international stage as a priority for development and human rights and rule of law and all of this stuff. And it had been a sleeper for a really long time because no one thought it was going to change. But now suddenly everyone is scrambling for anyone who spent any time in Burma and knows anything about it from a first-hand point of view. So you suddenly become like so much more of you can speak so much more knowledgeably, and you actually understand how all of these abstract concepts work out on the ground if you spend some time abroad. And if you have to do it without getting paid, find a way to do it.
Thanks.
Yeah, I guess I would just echo what everyone has said, but then also, you know, I think to a certain extent, you know, I think it's worthwhile not to get sort of fixated or discouraged by things that don't seem like they're going the right way. Maybe have some patience about it as well, because I think that, you know, I for instance, I went to Sierra Leone, and the whole goal was, you know, I had a job back in a law firm. The whole goal was great. I'll never go back. I'll stay in West Africa. I'll, you know, move down to Liberia afterwards. I'll continue to stay in the region. Ended up meeting my now wife while I was there. She, you know, where her PhD work was at. It just couldn't happen. So I came back to New York, took this corporate job that, you know, actually was surprisingly good. And the common focus, I mean, to get back to something John was saying, was, you know, I kept the focus on making sure I was doing international work, cross-border, something that kind of kept me involved in being overseas or at the least involved in something with an international dimension. And that, you know, that coupled with a little bit of patience and not really being upset because, oh God, you know, I'm not working for the UN in West Africa the way I thought I was going to. I mean, it ultimately sort of worked out in a way that made a lot more sense for me, frankly, in the long term, but allowed myself to sort of wander, I guess, but also at the same time, you know, keep this international focus so you're there and ready and to seize opportunities when they do arise.
Thank you. I think I'll add as a coda to all this that I think luck is a big part of the experience that many of us have who want to go into this field, but luck is also something a matter of perspective. So it's really recognizing that you can make something of where you're at the moment. It's not suddenly, you know, finding yourself with the person who's going to be your mentor and give you the job, but realizing that you can really stay at something and learn something, even if it kind of looks like a dead end. You know, I would just highlight a couple of things that all of them pointed to. One is flexibility. You really have to be flexible, and part of that is what I just said about luck. You know, being flexible means recognizing that there's something in what looks like a dog of an opportunity. You know, you might wind up back in New York at the firm that you were sure you were never going to go to. It also you really want to be willing to change and be able to change, and that's partly flexibility and partly a personality thing. But I think each one of these people talked about kind of changing in midstream. Maybe Jonathan less so, but you know, being a person who kind of took a look at where they were at and thought, okay, well, I'm going to try something different. I'm going to go somewhere else. I'm going to do something a little bit different, and that's sort of looking for opportunities, right? And recognizing that you don't have to make the decision for your career now.